Alexander Blackwell was no stranger to the weight of power. As the CEO of one of the most influential corporations in Texas, he had built an empire through ruthlessness, sharp intellect, and a cold, calculating demeanor. But even he couldn't escape the forces that bound him, a series of family debts and alliances that stretched back generations. The Blackwell family, once at the pinnacle of Texas wealth, was now teetering on the edge of collapse, and only a strategic marriage could save it. As the storm clouds of financial ruin loomed overhead, Alexander found himself in a position he never thought possible: a forced marriage. His father, once a formidable man, now frail and consumed by illness, insisted on this union to save their legacy. The bride-to-be was Sophia Carter, the daughter of a wealthy but less well-known family. Though Alexander had never met her, he was told that she was young, obedient, and would make the perfect match, a pawn in a game of power that only he could play. Sophia Carter, meanwhile, was not thrilled by this arrangement. She had dreams of her own, ambitions that did not involve becoming a mere extension of a powerful family's name. But like Alexander, she had no choice. She understood the game she had to play. Her father's debts were as great as the Blackwells, and if she refused, the consequences would be far worse than an unwanted marriage. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air in the grand ballroom was thick with tension. Guests murmured in hushed tones as Sophia walked down the aisle, her face a mask of composure, hiding the turmoil she felt inside. Alexander, standing at the altar, couldn't help but feel a strange unease. This union, while necessary, felt like a trap, one that neither of them had truly chosen. Little did he know, the woman standing before him was about to shatter everything he thought he knew about control, trust, and fate. Her true identity, hidden behind layers of carefully constructed lies, would soon come to light, and Alexander's world would never be the same again. The day after their lavish wedding, Alexander Blackwell and Sophia Carter were to meet for the first time as husband and wife. The sterile elegance of the Blackwell mansion, with its gleaming marble floors and vast, cold hallways, did little to ease the tension that clung to the air. Alexander had kept his distance from Sophia since the ceremony, and she, in turn, had barely spoken a word to him. Sophia had imagined a marriage filled with quiet moments of understanding, a bond formed over time, but this felt more like a business transaction than anything resembling a partnership. She had grown accustomed to the whispers of strangers who judged her for marrying into such power, but what bothered her most was the cold, unyielding man now sitting across from her at the dining table. Alexander was not the man she had expected. He was tall, with sharp features that seemed sculpted from stone, his dark eyes cold and calculating. His aura was one of command, yet there was something about him that felt broken. His usual confident air seemed forced when he looked at her. It was clear he saw her as a mere obligation, and nothing more. "Mrs. Blackwell, I trust you had a restful night," Alexander said, his voice smooth but distant. There was no warmth in his words, no sign of the comfort that one would expect in a new marriage. It was as if they were merely acquaintances forced into proximity. Sophia, who had kept her thoughts to herself up until that point, found her resolve hardening. "Call me Sophia," she replied coolly, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "And yes, I slept fine." The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. They were both trapped in a situation they hadn't chosen, but the disparity in their approaches to this forced union was glaring. Alexander, for all his power, was not a man who seemed willing to bend. He had likely never bent in his life. Everything about him screamed control. Control over his business, his life, and now over this marriage. But Sophia would not be controlled. She had her own pride, and her own ways of surviving the hand she had been dealt. For years she had been groomed to play the part of the perfect daughter, the obedient woman in a family struggling to hold on to what little wealth they had left. But there was more to Sophia than met the eye. She had secrets she intended to keep buried for as long as possible. "I trust you've already figured out what your role will be in this marriage," Alexander continued, the words spoken with a precision that bordered on cruel. "You'll attend the social events, maintain the family image, and support me in everything I do." Sophia felt her pulse quicken at the implication of his words. This was more than a marriage. It was an arrangement, a partnership of convenience. But there was something in the way he spoke that made her bristle. His cold demeanor, the way he treated her as though she were a mere accessory to his empire, made something inside her snap. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended, but filled with an edge of defiance. "Do you see me as nothing more than an accessory to your legacy, Mr. Blackwell?" Alexander's expression didn't shift, but she could see the slight flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to stay silent, to accept her role without question, just as he had. "You don't understand," he said, his voice darkening, the first crack in his composed exterior starting to show. "This isn't about you or me. This is about the Blackwell name. You knew what you were getting into." Sophia leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "So this is your game? Just business and legacy? No room for anything else?" For a moment, Alexander didn't answer. His fingers drummed lightly on the table as if considering her words. But when he spoke again, it was with a deliberate coldness, his voice laced with the edge of command that had made him feared in every room he entered. "You'll learn soon enough, Sophia. This is how things are. And we both play our parts or suffer the consequences." Sophia felt a surge of anger, but she swallowed it, locking her emotions behind a carefully constructed mask. She had no choice but to play along, for now. But she wasn't going to roll over and accept being treated like a pawn in his game of power. The tension between them was palpable. Alexander may have been the one who held the power in this marriage, but Sophia had something he didn't. She had a fire within her, a will that would not be easily broken. And as their first meal together came to an end, both of them knew that their arrangement would not be as simple as either had hoped. Their paths were now irrevocably intertwined, and neither could predict where their journey would take them. The days following their tense breakfast were not much different. Alexander was always cold, his business meetings endless, and Sophia found herself in a world of silence and formality. She spent her time in the vast garden of the Blackwell estate, lost in her thoughts, wondering how long she could keep pretending that this marriage was just a formality. The Blackwell mansion, with its opulent rooms and cold marble floors, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. But then one evening things changed, if only a little. Sophia had been sitting in the library flipping through the pages of a book she had picked up on a whim when Alexander appeared at the door. His usual stern expression was replaced by a slight furrow in his brow as if something had been troubling him. "Do you mind if I join you?" His voice was softer than usual, less commanding. For a brief moment, Sophia almost didn't recognize it. She glanced up from her book, unsure of how to react. He wasn't known for seeking her out unless there was something business-related on his mind. "I'm not sure I have anything that would interest you," she said, her words carrying a hint of irony. She wasn't used to him acting so human. He gave a brief chuckle, one that caught her off guard. It wasn't the cold, detached laugh she had come to expect from him, but something real. "I'm sure we could find something to talk about," he said, stepping further into the room. Sophia sat up straighter, eyeing him carefully. "You seem different today," she commented, not hiding the curiosity in her tone. She wasn't sure why, but his sudden change in demeanor intrigued her. Alexander remained silent for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face as though trying to find something he hadn't noticed before. Then, he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I know you're not happy with this arrangement, Sophia," he said, his voice quieter, almost reluctant. "But it wasn't exactly my choice either." Sophia blinked, surprised. For the first time since their wedding, there was a vulnerability in his voice. Something real. The hard edge that usually defined him was gone, replaced by a rare honesty. "You don't have to explain," she replied, her voice softer than before. "I understand why we're here. We both have our reasons." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "But that doesn't make this any easier." Alexander nodded, his gaze moving away from her as he took a seat in a nearby chair. They both sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their unspoken thoughts pressing in on them. Sophia, though still not completely convinced, was starting to see a side of him she hadn't expected. She had always viewed him as a man who lived and breathed control, but this side of Alexander Blackwell was unexpected. There was more to him than the ruthless CEO she had imagined. Beneath that cold exterior, she saw traces of someone who had been shaped by circumstances, someone who had suffered, just as she had. "Do you ever wonder," she asked suddenly, breaking the silence, "if there's more to life than all this?" Alexander turned his head to look at her, his gaze steady. "Of course I do," he replied, his voice low. "But the world doesn't give you much of a choice. We play the cards we're dealt." Sophia felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her at his words. It was strange, perhaps even dangerous, but she couldn't deny the flicker of connection that seemed to form between them in that moment. For a brief second, she saw not the powerful CEO, but a man who, like her, had been trapped by circumstances far beyond his control. "You're not the only one who's been forced into this situation," she said quietly. "I have my own struggles, my own secrets." Alexander's eyes sharpened at her words, but he said nothing, as though waiting for her to continue. Sophia hesitated, unsure of how much she was willing to reveal. She had been keeping her own demons locked away for so long, but something about Alexander's presence, the rare openness in his demeanor, made her want to share, to let him in, even just a little. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "This marriage was never my choice, but it's the only option I have. I have things to protect." Her words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Alexander, though usually an expert at hiding his emotions, seemed to understand. His gaze softened for just a moment, and for the first time since their wedding, Sophia saw a glimmer of something, maybe empathy, shine through his normally implacable exterior. "We both have things we're protecting, don't we?" he said quietly. It was the first moment of true understanding between them. It wasn't much, and the distance between them was still vast, but something had shifted. Something small, but significant. For the first time, they were both speaking not as strangers forced into a marriage, but as two people caught in the same storm. As the evening drew to a close, neither of them spoke much more. But in the silence, there was an unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage could be more than either of them had anticipated. The days following their quiet conversation in the library had been different. The ice between them had not melted entirely, but cracks had begun to form. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, where Alexander found himself looking at Sophia with something other than cold detachment, and that was dangerous. He wasn't a man who allowed emotions to dictate his decisions. He had built his empire on logic and control, but something about Sophia made him feel unsettled. He didn't understand why. Not yet. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Alexander was in his study reviewing a new business acquisition when his private line rang. Few people had this number. Fewer still dared to use it. "This is Blackwell," he answered. A deep, unfamiliar voice responded. "Mr. Blackwell, I think it's time we talk about your wife." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The man chuckled darkly. "Someone who knows the truth. The truth about Sophia Carter." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. The way the man said her name, it wasn't casual. It wasn't a bluff. He knew something. "I don't have time for games," Alexander said, voice cold as steel. "Oh, I think you do," the man replied smoothly. "Did she ever tell you why her family was so desperate for this marriage? Did she ever tell you about her real last name?" Alexander felt something inside him tighten. "What the hell are you talking about?" A pause, then the man dropped the bombshell. "Sophia Carter doesn't exist. The woman you married is Sophia Reynolds, the daughter of the man who destroyed your family." The words hit like a wrecking ball. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. The Reynolds name was poison in his family. His father's business empire had nearly collapsed years ago because of one man, William Reynolds. Reynolds had been a cutthroat businessman, ruthless in his pursuit of power. He had betrayed the Blackwells, orchestrated a hostile takeover that nearly crushed them. His father had spent years fighting to rebuild their legacy, but the betrayal had cost them dearly. And now, his daughter was in Alexander's house, in his bed, wearing his ring. The realization made his blood run cold. Alexander ended the call without another word, his mind racing. He had been played. She had lied to him. Sophia was his enemy. Sophia was in their bedroom when Alexander stormed in, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. She barely had time to react before he grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him. "Tell me your name," he demanded, voice low and dangerous. Sophia's breath caught. "Alexander, tell me your real name," he roared. Her heart pounded. She had always known this moment would come. She had spent years preparing for it. But now that she was standing face to face with the man she had deceived, her carefully crafted defenses felt weak. She hesitated, but Alexander already knew. He could see it in her eyes. "Sophia Reynolds." He spat the name like venom. The air between them was suffocating. She swallowed hard, knowing there was no use in denying it. "Yes," she whispered. "That's my real name." A deadly silence fell between them. Alexander stepped back, his expression unreadable. "So what was the plan?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. "Seduce me? Gain my trust? Destroy my family from the inside?" Sophia flinched at the bitterness in his tone. "No, it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" He stepped closer, his presence towering over her. "You lied to me from the beginning. Why? Was it revenge? Was it money?" Tears burned in Sophia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I didn't have a choice," she said, voice shaking. "My father—" She stopped herself. Alexander's jaw clenched. "Your father was a snake." Sophia looked away. "I know," she whispered. That caught him off guard. "I know what my father did," she continued. "I know he destroyed your family. I know he was ruthless, cruel. But you have to understand, Alexander, I never wanted this life. I was forced into it just like you were." Alexander wanted to believe her, but how could he? How could he trust anything she said when she had built their entire relationship on a lie? "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice hollow. Sophia took a step forward, her hands trembling. "I wanted to. Every day I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" "Because I was scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Scared that you would look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Alexander felt something twist painfully inside him. Betrayal, anger, confusion. But beneath all of it, there was something worse, something he didn't want to admit. He still wanted her, even knowing who she was, even knowing the truth. And that realization terrified him. Alexander turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do with you," he admitted, his voice raw. Sophia took a shaky breath. "Then don't push me away." He laughed bitterly. "You expect me to just forget everything? To pretend like none of this happened?" "No," she whispered. "I just want a chance to prove that I'm not my father." Alexander stared at her for a long moment. Could he trust her? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Nothing between them would ever be the same again. And as the night stretched on, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a marriage anymore. It was war. The days after the confrontation were unbearable. Alexander had withdrawn completely, leaving Sophia alone in the mansion, suffocated by silence. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. He simply stopped looking at her, as if she were nothing more than a ghost haunting his home. It hurt more than she expected. She had known the truth would destroy whatever fragile connection they had built, but she hadn't anticipated this cold, suffocating emptiness. She wanted to fix things, but how do you fix something when trust has been shattered? One evening, Sophia found herself in his study. Alexander was sitting behind his desk, reading over documents, but the moment she stepped inside, he stiffened. She had seen him angry before. She had seen his ruthless, controlling nature. But this was different. This wasn't fury. It was distance. "I'm leaving," she said softly. Alexander didn't react. "I'm going back to my father's estate," she continued. "I'll have the lawyers draft the annulment. You'll be free of me soon." Still nothing, but just as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "That's what you want?" Sophia's hands clenched into fists. "No," she admitted, her voice raw. "But it's what you want." Finally, he looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes nearly broke her. Pain. Deep, unresolved pain hidden beneath layers of pride and betrayal. "I don't know what I want," Alexander said finally. His voice was strained, as if admitting it was painful. Sophia's heart pounded. If there was ever a moment to fight for him, for them, this was it. "I never lied about one thing," she whispered. Alexander's expression darkened. "And what's that?" She took a shaky breath. "I never lied about how I felt about you." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Then, a bitter laugh escaped him. "Do you even know what that means?" "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "I love you." The words hung between them, unspoken truths finally laid bare. Alexander stared at her, his emotions unreadable. She braced herself for rejection, for him to walk away. But then, he did something she never expected. He kissed her. Not a soft, hesitant kiss, but one filled with frustration, passion, need. It was messy, desperate, fueled by everything they had fought against. And in that moment, the war between them became something else entirely. When they finally pulled apart, Alexander's forehead rested against hers. "This doesn't fix anything," he murmured. Sophia nodded. "I know. But," he swallowed hard, "maybe we don't have to fix everything all at once." A flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe this was only the beginning. The next morning, Sophia stood by the grand windows of their bedroom, watching the Texas sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Alexander stepped up behind her, his presence no longer cold but uncertain. "This marriage was a deal," he murmured. "A business arrangement." She turned to him. "And now?" Alexander studied her, as if searching for an answer. Finally, he said, "Now, it's something else." They weren't perfect. They weren't even sure what they were. But for the first time since this marriage began, they weren't fighting alone. And maybe that was enough. For now.